I see that we have quorum.
As the members know, a vacancy arose in the office of the chair, conformément à l'article 106.
Pursuant
Conformément à l'article 106.
Pursuant to Standing Order 106.3a, as clerk of the committee, I will preside over electing the chair.
Of the committee can only receive motions for the election of the chair. The clerk cannot receive other types of motions, cannot entertain points of order, nor participate in debate. Nous pouvons donc procéder à...
We can now proceed to electing the chair. Pursuant to Standing Order 106.2, the chair must be a member of the government party.
Motions for the chair. Mr. Weiler?
I'd like to nominate my neighbor and my colleague, the Honourable Hetty Fry, for the chair position.
Mr. Weiler moves that Eddie Fry be elected as chair of the committee. Are there any further motions? Mr. Arnold?
I'd like to make the motion that Mr. Morrissey, having sat on this committee for over 10 years, be elected chair of the committee.
Mr. Clerk, I decline.
Are there any further motions?
I nominate. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Mr. Small?
Since the riding of Avalon has had such a history of having their member of Parliament be the chair of this committee, and Mr. Connors as well served under that chair and is very familiar with the workings of the committee, so I nominate Mr. Connors.
I thank my colleague from across the way and for his nomination, but I respectfully decline.
Are there any further motions? Je vais maintenant soumettre.
I will now submit the motion to the committee. It is moved by Mr. Weiler that Hetty Fry be elected chair of the committee.
Committee to adopt the motion. I declare the motion carried and Eddie Fry duly elected chair of the committee. I invite Dr. Fry to take the chair.
Good morning, everyone. And what a terrible way to start as chair. I want to apologize to all of you profusely for being late. My cab was supposed to arrive. It didn't arrive. We called, had to get another one. So here I am. But I really do apologize, guys, for this. Thank you very much. And so thank you for electing me. I hope I will be worthy of filling the shoes of Mr. Weiler, who I've known for such a long time, and who's an excellent MP, and I know was an excellent chair because I sat in last meeting and watched how he chaired. And I want to congratulate this committee on being a committee that is respectful and collegial and want to get the things done that you want to get done, which is to make sure fisheries on both coasts work well, and that you actually make sure that your reports mean something. So thank you again. I hope I can do justice to this committee. Thank you.
Mr. Arnold wants to speak.
Yes, sorry.
Welcome, Madam Chair. Congratulations on being elected as chair. I'd like to take just a couple of short moments to thank Mr. Weiler for his fair and judicious chair of this committee for the past months. It was good to work with you as a vice chair. I look forward to the same openness and collegiality that we've experienced on this committee over the 10+ years that myself and Mr. Morrissey have been on this committee. I think we've done a lot of good work across party lines in efforts to improve the fisheries and I say fisheries, that means fish stocks and the fisheries, the people that participate in harvesting those stocks. I think we can continue to do that work, and I hope that your vision and statement that you like to see the congeniality that takes place in this committee to continue, and I very much hope for the same thing. Thank you.
Chair. Thank you, Chair. I would just like to support the comments from my colleague, Mr. Arnold, that reflect well the work of this committee.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that Mr. Morrissey, I've known most of you for a long time, and I think I'm looking forward to this. You wouldn't believe that being a very urban Vancouver Centre MP, that I have one of the largest fisheries in my riding. Actually, it's on Granville Island, a lot of shellfish, and a lot of fishers live there. So I depend on fishers to vote for me at the end of the day. So thank you. This is going to be a learning curve for me, and I know I will learn from all of you about what is what, etc., except that I know, you know, salmon, sockeye. That's all I have to say. Thank you. To the table.
The online test is done.
Thanks. Welcome to Bienvenue à la réunion.
Welcome to meeting number 36 of the Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans.
I want to acknowledge that we're gathered here on the ancestral lands of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Pursuant to Standing Order 108, the committee's meeting to continue its study of the factors determining opening and closing dates of marine harvesting seasons. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format according to the standing orders. Pursuant to our routine motions, I would like to advise committee that members, all witnesses appearing virtually today, have successfully conducted the required testing. And I want to remind participants of the following points. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating in the video conference, click on the microphone. You will see a little globe-looking thing, and that will give you the language you wish to speak and participate in. A reminder that all comments should be addressed to the chair. And for members in the room, obviously you know this by now, if you wish to speak, please use your raise hand function, and the clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best as we can. I would now like to welcome our witnesses from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. Bernard Vigneault, Director General, Ecosystem Science Directorate. Mr. Vigneault, welcome. Todd Williams, Senior Director, Resource Management Operations, and is Mr. Davis here? Yes. No. Oh, he's on. Sorry, Mr. Davis. Neil Davis, Regional Director, Fisheries Management Branch, Pacific Region. We will start with the opening statement of Mr. Vigneault. 5 minutes for your opening statement, and I will literally give you a shout out when you have 1 minute and then another one at 30 seconds, just to kind of orientate you. Thank you very much. Begin, please, Monsieur Vigneault, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll actually ask my colleague, Todd Williams, to read our remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Madam Chair and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss Fisheries and Oceans processes for determining the timing of fishing seasons. My name is Todd Williams, Senior Director of Fish Management Operations, and I'm joined here today by Bernard Vigneault, Director General, Ecosystem Sciences Director, and Neil Davis, Regional Director, Fisheries Management Pacific Region. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which I speak is the traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe. Safety is our non-negotiable priority. Opening day for competitive fisheries is often characterized by a race to fish. En fixant les horaires d'ouverture et de fermeture des saisons de pêche,
The department emphasizes fishers' safety while trying to balance scientific considerations and environmental considerations in managing fisheries and the economic viability of fisheries.
Atlantic and northern fisheries, sea ice often delays openings. We monitor ice thickness and movement in real time to ensure safe fleet and search and rescue operations, and work closely with Transport Canada, the Canadian Coast Guard, and harvester representatives to discuss opening date possibilities. The maintenance of our small craft harbors is also vital to ensuring safe fishery operations. We recognize the importance of dredging in many of our facilities, particularly in the spring. Science and environmental factors are also critically important. Seasons are often timed to avoid sensitive periods, such as spawning and molting. This ensures that we are not harvesting species when they are most vulnerable, or when the quality of the catch, such as softshell crab, would be suboptimal. We also account for the broader ecosystem, including the presence of species at risk. For example, the migration of North Atlantic right whale necessitates dynamic closures to prevent entanglements. Fisheries are a business, and the timing of a season can be the difference between a profitable year and a loss. We work with industry to identify market windows, periods when global demand and prices are highest. If a season opens too late, Canadian harvesters may miss out on a lucrative holiday market or international buying cycles. We also avoid supply gluts. Strategic timing helps prevent supply gluts, ensuring predictability for processing plants and helping keep prices stable. La régime de gestion lui-même.
The management regime itself influences our approach to setting and opening closing dates.
Les mentionnés plus tôt, dont les pêcheries compétitives.
When it comes to competitive fisheries, precise opening times are essential for fairness, as every harvester is competing for a share of the total allowable catch at the same time. In cases where that's not possible, we work with harvesters to find a date and time that works.
Les pêcheries à quota individuel.
With individual quotas, where a harvester's share is more or less guaranteed, we can offer wider seasonal windows. It allows harvesters to fish the market and choose their own best time to go out, which significantly reduces economic pressure and improves safety.
No one knows the water better than the people on it. Our advisory committees provide a collaborative forum for harvesters to offer real-world intelligence on water temperatures, fish quality, and local conditions. We hear this through our advisory committee processes and in many of our deliberations before the season opens. To stay responsive, we use variation orders, allowing us to adjust openings and closings on short notice. Enfin, nous gérons ces saisons dans le cadre de...
The flexibility vital for this includes prioritizing fisheries for food and ritual purposes, and working alongside First Nations to implement the right to fish in pursuit of a moderate livelihood.
Determining a fishing season is a multi-dimensional puzzle. We must ensure the safety of the fleet, protect the stock, and position the industry to be globally competitive. As climate change makes our seasons less predictable, the department is committed to a management approach that is as adaptive and resilient as the harvesters we serve. We're happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now we will begin with Mr. Arnold for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll start out my questioning with Mr. Davis, who is online. Mr. Davis, last year in 2025, the Fraser River sockeye salmon season was extremely challenging for harvesters in all sectors, with abundance coming back multiple times higher than what was initially predicted. The department seemed to be either reluctant or restrained in opening up access to commercial and public fisheries during that time. What organizations actually have input and influence into the decisions and direction of the Pacific Salmon Commission in directing this binational stock?
Good morning, and thank you for the question. So we have both pre-season and in-season processes to ensure engagement with all affected or interested users. Pre-season, beginning early in the calendar year or in December, we begin our consultations on developing an integrated fisheries management plan for salmon. So we are consulting with advisory bodies that include representatives of commercial, recreational, harvesters, First Nations, and over the months of the winter and spring, begin to develop a plan specific to sockeye in the Fraser. We have an obligation under the Pacific Salmon Treaty to develop an escapement plan. That plan defines how many fish we want to escape to spawning grounds, and then the rules we will use to try and achieve that outcome. Once the season arrives, an important body that plays a role in the management of both Fraser sockeye and pink salmon fisheries on the Fraser is the Fraser Panel. So this is a body convened under the Pacific Salmon Treaty with U.S. and Canadian representatives. On the Canadian side, we have representatives from, again, commercial, recreational, and First Nations sectors that we're consulting with to ensure that we're getting their feedback on how to make decisions as more time or more data rolls in over the course of the season.
Thank you for that. Do any of these organizations feeding up through this chain of direction or recommendations, do any of them have binding authority on what the final decision will be?
The short answer is no. We have commitments to engage with all of those groups. We have bilateral relationships with First Nations organizations. All of that becomes advice to the department, and the department takes it all into consideration before making decisions to implement fisheries.
One has a veto power that if the science is there, there should continue to be expanded fisheries. Would that be correct?
There is no group with a veto power. The department, and as delegated by the minister, has the authority to be making the decisions over the opening and closing of fisheries.
Then last year, when there was this incredible abundance that came back, I believe it was the highest on record for that broodstock cycle, because we understand that there are different broodstock cycle years, but this was incredibly high for that broodstock cycle year, a record number, and yet the U.S. Panel members with the Pacific Salmon Commission were recommending an opening, and the Canadians were opposed to that, but did not provide any rationale for opposing it. Why was it that the U.S. or the Canadian side didn't propose or provide any rationale for not supporting the opening of the fishery?
Yeah, important questions. Thank you. Maybe I'll just begin by stepping back one point. So the return that was forecast was well within the range that the department had set out pre-season, which was between like 750,000 fish and 13,000 fish when it comes to sockeye, and I assume that's the species we're talking about here. The run returned at around 9 million in the end when we tallied up all of the returns and made our final estimate.
1 minute.
There were points in season where the U.S. proposed to undertake fisheries and Canada disagreed. The key reason for that is that when we manage Fraser sockeye, there are many stocks within that species that are returning, and we manage all of those stocks in 4 management units. not all of those management units return at the same levels of abundance. And as a result, the ones that return at lower levels of abundance, in particular the late summer management unit, constrains opportunity for other more abundant management units that they co-migrate with. So they're moving through the system at the same time. In the case of the fishery that the U.S. Proposed, which I think you're referring to, Canada was concerned about the impacts that that fishery would have on the total allowable mortality that we were trying to achieve on the late summer run.
Can you please wrap up? It's you over time, thanks, but finish your sentence.
Sure. So that is the main reason that Canada opposed, and Canada's opposition was borne out. The U.S. did harvest more than its share of the late summer, and that was the basis of Canada's concern.
Thank you very much. For 6 minutes, please, Patrick.
Thank you, Chair, and I want to thank our officials for being here in person to answer questions and also by video conference. I want to pick up on a very local concern for me and my constituents. In this study, we've heard from witnesses that have pointed to some localized science and monitoring in Howe Sound, indicating a very low interaction risk of stocks of concern. They referenced a DFO stock assessment in 2022 that found that encounters of Fraser River stocks of concern were very rare, posing near zero risk in Howe Sound. And in 2024, they pointed to a DFO-led reference fishery that sampled 354 adult Chinook in April and May and found that none identified as originating from Fraser River stocks of concern. And so there's obviously a limited mark-selected fishery in this area would deliver significant social and economic benefits, and it's been a big frustration for folks locally that there hasn't been retention opportunities. And so my question is, given that the testimony and the available data, what is the primary factor currently preventing DFO from authorizing any retention opportunities in Howe Sound? And to what extent is the current non-retention decision driven by biological risk specific to Howe Sound versus the application of broader precautionary principle or other management constraints?
So thank you, Madam Chair, for the question. Yes, in fact, the department has conducted the testing in Howe Sound to look at the possibility of future opportunity for mark selective fishery. Results are encouraging. As the member mentioned, we had a significant proportion of the catch that were the targeted species, the mark Chinook salmon, around 30 to 40%. There was limited number of stocks that aim to protect, so that's all encouraging. But we cannot just extrapolate. We have to continue to analysis. In particular, in this case, these data are all from our own science work. We also need to do the correlation with the data that's collected from the Creel survey and be able to do the extrapolation of those numbers over a full recreational harvest under mark selective scenario. The Government of Canada announced the future expansion of mark selective fishery in the Pacific region. That would certainly be a candidate where with the signs that have been collected and the analysis ongoing on the Creel survey extrapolation, we'll be able to provide an advice on that.
Thank you, Mr. Vigneault, and that's some encouraging testimony to hear. I was wondering if you might be able to speak to what specific evidence, threshold, or change in conditions that would be required for DFO to consider opening up a limited controlled retention fishery in that area.
To that, I will ask my colleague Neil Davis to add information. It depends on the science I described, also the capacity to mark fish, which is increasing as well. Neil.
Sure, and thank you for the question. I think that you've got the gist in that in doing that extrapolation and assessing all of the data we have, we'd be looking at a few things. The first is that conservation risk. So what would the encounter rates of any stocks of concern be? And that's not necessarily limited to just Fraser-bound stocks. I believe there have also been some questions about the ability to collect sufficient brood stock for local Chinook stocks in Howe Sound that we would also be assessing. And we, as my colleague mentioned, we would be also sort of looking at moving forward, if we were to contemplate fisheries here, what kind of capacity do we have to mass mark such that it could facilitate mark selective fisheries? And in a fishery we permit, would the capture of marked fish, would that rate be high enough such that our concern for the catch of unmarked fish and the subsequent release of those fish and any associated mortality is low enough that we think it doesn't pose any risks to those unmarked stocks that would be caught and returned to the water? So those would be examples of some of the factors we would carefully assess.
Thank you. I'm going to switch gears and bring up a point that was brought up earlier, which is the rush to get to these fisheries as they're opening up, and some of the challenges with in-season decision making and communication. I was hoping you might be able to speak to how Fisheries and Oceans is improving the timeliness, predictability, and communication of in-season opening decisions, particularly for small commercial harvesters who oftentimes, and certainly this is the case of harvesters from my riding, face long travel times and financial risk from uncertain or late announcements.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the question, Madam Chair. Fisheries and Oceans has a number of processes in place, both formal and informal. Formally through our advisory committee process, which
30 seconds
meets annually every year. In addition to that, we have frequent communications through email, through other communications, notices to harvesters, which are much more timely and are able to get that information out faster and in a more timely way for those in-season decisions, which are critically important, particularly on salmon fisheries on the West Coast.
Thank you very much, Mr. Weiler. I now go to Monsieur Champoux for 6 minutes, please.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank the witnesses for being here today. For my part, I want to talk about material resources, the operational capacity of the Coast Guard and DFO. According to the testimony we've heard, they seem to be the main bottlenecks when it comes to fishing crab in the St. Lawrence Gulf. The committee heard the testimony of Mr. Daniel Desbois, president of the Gaspé crab fishers. He explained very clearly that preparation has improved over the years, but the system doesn't seem to be following. The icebreakers were expected at the beginning of March. They arrived at the beginning of April. A tow wasn't available for nearly a month. Appropriate equipment wasn't available, which meant that icebreakers had to go through several times because ice had time to reform. And there are consequences for crab fishers. Delays in spring, even just a few days, have an impact. They push back fish days all the way to June with additional fuel costs and a greater fishery effort when the risk of interacting with right whales increases significantly. That's what I want to talk about. Obviously, you work with the Coast Guard. It might be the opportunity to explain why the Coast Guard regularly is lacking equipment. Is it a matter of budgets? Is it a matter of availability? Is it how everything is prioritized at that time of year? Is it a matter of annual planning? I would like to hear what you have to say on the matter.
Merci pour la question. I think in terms of our approach with the Coast Guard, a couple of points. First, the Coast Guard is no longer a part of Fisheries and Oceans. That is known. However, we do work very closely with the Coast Guard. As I noted in my opening remarks, with respect to those opening dates, and making sure, to the best of our abilities, that we have the equipment in the right place at the right time. The honourable member is absolutely correct in that there is a greater risk of whale interaction with North Atlantic right whales later in the season. And one of the best mitigation measures is to actually start fishing earlier in the season. And with that, there is a greater chance of ice interactions and ice preventing harvesters from getting out. We do work very closely with the Coast Guard. On a daily basis, we interact with the Coast Guard, Transport Canada, and the Harvester Associations to keep them informed if there is going to be a delay. I can't speculate, and I won't speculate in terms of the finances or availability in a particular case with respect to the Coast Guard, but I can say that the relationship is very strong, and we work together on a daily basis.
Aucun doute sur la collaboration. Il y a cependant plusieurs enjeux qui sont plus des impondérables que des choses qui sont très prévisibles.
As opposed to things that might be very predictable. For instance, this year, there was a delay due to the lack of equipment and the ice cover, but there was also the presence of a whale in Zone 12, much earlier than what we were accustomed to. That's also part of the factors that have to be taken into account when it comes to a season like the one we're starting, which is particularly difficult for crab fishers. At the end of a season like this one, I would imagine that you must work with those like the Coast Guard. Are there measures taken in order to prevent those events from happening again? For example, in 2027, will the DFO take concrete steps to ensure that we've taken into account everything in order to start the season as early as possible, in order to avoid this type of situation, which, of course, we can't always control?
Merci pour la question.
Thank you for the question.
Indeed, at the end of every season, there is a debrief and a recap of the season in terms of what went right, what could we do better, in terms of our integration with the Coast Guard and collaboration in that regard. At the same time, there are a number of natural elements, environmental, that we don't have control over from year to year, whether that's the ice conditions or the appearance of whales, which result in closures. And we understand the negative impact that has on harvesters. We also realize the importance of having these closure measures in place from a market access perspective and in ensuring a comparability finding with the United States market under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. So we do try to certainly work with the harvesters post-season and with Coast Guard to identify if improvements could be made.
Est-ce qu'on serait capable, par exemple, d'établir une date?
Would it be possible to set a reference date for de-icing, or for breaking the ice, rather? Is there a report on the general state of ice in the Gulf? Is that an approach that might be feasible?
Merci pour la question.
Thank you for the question.
Indeed, we do have ice reports generated daily, and we do provide that information to harvesters and in collaboration with the Coast Guard.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Shampoo. I now go to the second round, which is a 5 minutes, 2.555 round. And I start with Mr. Small for 5 minutes. Please, Clifford.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome to this committee as our chair. And thank you to the witnesses for being available to us today for this study. To Monsieur Vignon, Americans are fishing mackerel right now. They've set a quota of nearly 11,000 metric tons. While Canadian harvesters have to sit idly by this year and watch Americans fish mackerel while their mackerel fishery stays closed. Will that happen?
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the question. Yeah, we're aware of the change of decision for the mackerel fisheries in the U.S., like we've discussed at a previous meeting. What we have undertaken to address this is to do science advice for Atlantic mackerel a year before schedule. It's now scheduled for May 27. That will allow us to use not only the most recent egg and larvae survey in our harvester observation, but it will also allow us to include in our calculation the removals that have been decided in the U.S. That will feed into advisory committee meeting. We'll be able to share the information.
So how about if your scientists go to sea and they don't find the eggs and larvae, has been the experience in the past, will you consider the fishers on the water experience? Because, you know, the Prime Minister in April before last was in Newfoundland and Labrador and said that he'd make decisions based on what he heard on the wharves. So are you going to go along with what the Prime Minister said when he made that statement? Are you going to consider harvester observations this year?
So there's different component to the decision process. For the science advice, we'll continue to work with the harvester to do the updated science with the best information, science data available. There will be representative from the industry participating, and that will be presented to the advisory committee. And then from a departmental perspective, the stakeholder inputs are considered specifically in parallel to the science. That's part of the advisory committee process.
So under this current Minister of Fisheries, is it policy of DFO currently to match the American quota pound for pound, as has happened for decades in the past? Is that still the policy, yes or no?
I can speak to that, Mr. Chair. Madam Chair, sir.
Why can't you speak to it?
Because
you're the director of science.
Yeah, and my role is to advise the minister through the best science available that is based on the scientific data collected in the water and so on. It's not based on any policies or pre-assumption for the decision in terms of the management.
So how can the American science vary so drastically when it comes to Atlantic mackerel to the science of Canada? How can there be such an offset?
Because the Americans are actually doing overall assessment for two different components that is not the same as in Canada, where we assess only the northern component. In fact, the Americans have used our Canadian data for their assessment. So the difference in the two is they look at the overall mackerel, both the northern and southern contingent.
So are they fishing the northern component right now? The Americans, are they fishing the northern component right now?
They're fishing mostly the southern component, which is the one that saw signs of improvement recently. They are fishing a proportion of the northern component as well right now. That's part of the science advice to come. We'll do projections based on different assumption on the rate.
So are you certain of where the mackerel that migrate through Canadian waters, are you certain of where they overwinter? Are you certain?
Yeah, that's part of the uncertainty for the science advice. When we do the advice, we use a range of hypotheses explicitly to account for the fact that we don't have right now right tools to be able to separate the fish.
Why don't we have the tools?
Thank you. I think we're coming to closing this session. Thanks. Thank you. Did you finish what you had to say, Mr. Vigneault?
Thank you, Madam. Just quickly, it's ongoing research. To date, we have not been able to develop the genetic analytical tool that will help us separate the fishing on the U.S. ground. Thank you.
I now go to Mr. Klassen for the Liberals. 5 minutes, please, Ernie.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for being present here with us today. Mr. Davis, there was, as you know, a lot of talk around fishers in 2025 and the overabundance of a return, which was unprecedented from my understanding. You talked about organizations that were involved in the decision-making process in season especially, and I'm wondering what factors are considered when making those decisions.
Thank you for the question. So I'm going to work with the assumption we're talking again about Fraser sockeye here, and the in-season process associated with that fishery. But please correct me if I'm off base. Factors that would go into considering, what kinds of fishing opportunities we provide. First and foremost, our job one is meeting our conservation objectives. So I mentioned that we develop an escapement plan each year for Fraser sockeye. That escapement plan will define what our conservation objectives are and how much of each management unit for Fraser sockeye we're attempting to get back to the spawning grounds. Once we can assess, what kinds of choices might support our conservation objectives, we would also be considering the priority of providing opportunity for First Nations food, social, and ceremonial fisheries, and then also providing commercial and recreational opportunities. The other thing I'll mention is that this is a fishery that's managed under the auspices of the Pacific Salmon Treaty. So another consideration is how we manage in a way that is consistent with the treaty in terms of providing opportunities for both Canada and U.S. harvesters. And then one other thing is that particularly when it comes to in-river fisheries, we're conscious of the fact that, number one, we want to manage the rate at which catch is happening when we know that catch will need to be constrained. So if, for example, we had all fisheries opened at once, the rate of catch might be something higher than we think would be appropriate to ensure we don't overshoot the allowable catches we set. And number two, that there are some operational and just sort of practical constraints of having buddy open at once in a constrained waterway. So we often sort of assess some kind of sequencing of the opening so that each sector, when they have an opportunity, can effectively sort of undertake their opportunity without interference or the potential for conflict between sectors on the river. Those would be examples of some factors we would consider.
Thank you very much. A second question, not really related to that, but related to the salmon run and the Fraser River. How do I have a lot of colleagues that raise the issue of dredging, and I'm wondering, does that have an impact on the opening and closing of the season?
Yes, thank you. That there is dredging that can occur in the Fraser River. So in considering when dredging would happen, part of that is assessing when is best to avoid or reduce to the greatest extent possible impacts on fish and fish habitat so that we are doing our best to mitigate any negative implications for fish or for fisheries.
And I think to Mr. Viano, our government recently announced a move to increase mass marking for hatchery-raised salmon. This has been a major ask from the recreational fishery in BC. How will this impact the sport and recreational fishing, as well as the opening season and the tourism sector in BC?
The question. Mass marking is a tool to enable selective fisheries. It's used to a small extent right now in southern BC, and the ongoing science work to look at the actual details of the interception in areas that have ongoing mark selective or that are proposed, like Owen Sound that we've discussed earlier. All that science work will support decision to enable larger access of mark selective fisheries. The other component of it is to have the science and capacity regarding the actual marking of the fish, because it depends on the capacity to have a large proportion of the aquaculture fish that are being marked. That allows the opportunity for the mark selective fishery. It allows to have a recreative fishery when fish can be kept that are targeted, that are raised from the hatchery, and to put back in the water the salmon stocks that we want to protect.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vigneault. I now go to Mr. Shampoo. 2 minutes, demi.
2.5 minutes. Thank you, Madam Chair. Earlier, Mr. Williams, you lacked a bit of time at the end of my question. I wanted to give you the opportunity to talk more about the opportunity of setting a date for opening fisheries in order to meet the requests of crab fishers in the Gulf. If we had an opening date that was set, that was decided ahead of time, would DFO and the Coast Guard be able to respect that, knowing that the fishery has to be open at a certain date, and so the material means will be brought to bear in order to ensure access with available equipment, icebreakers, and everything else that you're aware of. We don't control the science, and we don't control the water temperature, of course. Some factors may enter into account, but if we were to plan for a set date, is that something that would be feasible and would allow us to get ahead of the problems we encountered this year?
Merci pour la question.
Thank you for the question.
Indeed, many of the dates that we do have for not only snow crab in the Gulf, but most fisheries that we manage have set season dates, which are agreed to in advance and actually don't vary from year to year. With that said, there are others that are open all year long through regulation, and then the regional director general of that region can then vary through a variation order the opening in season within, or that opening date or closing date based on the conditions at the time and in consultation with harvesters. So the short answer is yes, absolutely, and in most cases we do that.
When it comes to the material problems, do you think something is going to be done during the current year to ensure that we're not in the same situation next year? It seemed that there were problems with equipment. Equipment was simply not available when it was expected to open the fishery at the expected date. Are we going to experience that again, or are concrete measures being studied in order to prevent that delay next year? 10 seconds.
Indeed. We look at this in advance of the season, and we study it after the season if there have been issues, and to try to make sure that equipment is available so we don't repeat issues like that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. My question, I think, is to Mr. Davis, but feel free if someone else feels more adequately prepared to answer. My question is outside of an emergency, does the government and DFO require sign-off or consensus from the Musqueam Band in making decisions regarding the fisheries, including pre-season, in-season, and post-season decisions, including, for example, opening and closing dates in the relevant area?
Thank you. Yes, I think I can take that question. So as I was describing earlier, it isn't that the case that any group has a veto per se over opening and closing decisions, but in the case of the Musqueam, there are Musqueam fisheries that would be undertaken, and there are fisheries that may occur in that area that other sectors may participate in. So number one, I would say that we try to collaborate very closely with the Musqueam and take their input very seriously. In the case of planning their own fisheries, we would be trying to work with them as best as possible to define a plan for opening their fisheries that they are supportive of. In the case of other fisheries
Davis,
that may be occurring...
If I can jump in there just to try to get more specific, because I have the text of the Musqueam agreement in front of me. So what I'm trying to zero in on is effects on recreational and commercial fishers in what the government identifies as the traditional territory of the Musqueam First Nation. And the word used throughout the agreement is consensus. And I feel like you dodged Mr. Arnold's question that there is a caveat that the minister's allowed to exercise discretion in the case of an emergency. But my question is, outside the case of an emergency, do you require sign-off or consensus from the Musqueam First Nation regarding fisheries decisions that are being made in this area? It's a pretty clear question.
Yeah, so I think the intent is we would strive for consensus. We acknowledge we may not get it on all cases. And in those cases, we would move forward with a decision that takes into consideration what we heard from the Musqueam and other users when opening or closing fisheries.
Okay, so this fisheries working group that's identified in the Musqueam Agreement, outside of an emergency, you are not required to basically reach consensus with them. That's what I was reading in the agreement. So that's if that's the clarification you're providing, then that's great. That's what I'm asking about.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything further to add. Thank you.
Well, can you provide clarity? I mean, I'm asking the questions here.
Yes, of course. So we strive to reach consensus. We acknowledge we may not achieve consensus on all decision points. When we don't, we move forward with making a decision that it takes into account everything we've heard from the Musqueam and other user groups where those user groups are relevant to the decision.
Okay, thank you. Now, and again, this might be towards Mr. Williams, but feel free, Mr. Davis, if you'd like to jump in as well. You said in your opening remarks that you work with industries and harvesters to set opening and closing dates. Yet this past summer, I was inundated with complaints from commercial and recreational fishermen throughout British Columbia and in my riding about how slow the department was to open the sockeye fishery on the Fraser River. Is that despite early results from test boats, for example, that kind of showed the returns being much higher than were originally anticipated? Do you share that conclusion of many commercial and recreational fishermen that the department was too slow in opening the fishery?
Thanks for the question, Madam Chair. I think I will refer that one to Mr. Davis.
Yes, thank you. This is a very important question, so appreciate the chance to speak to it. The decision-making process is constantly responding to updates to in-season information. So the Fraser panel meets twice a week in season to review updated stock assessment information and make new decisions about whether there should be adjustments in our total allowable catches for different species. And in that process, we're engaging with those representatives in the Canadian delegation from recreational, commercial, First Nations users to make those decisions in as timely a way as possible, and then turn it around and publish something like a fishery notice so that people know beyond just our representatives at the panel what's going to happen. One of the things we've done this year, after all of the concerns that were raised last summer, is we've started that discussion process with our domestic advisory bodies sooner to leave more time to talk about how do we set out our options for defining that escapement plan, and then how do we engage with people in season so that people have the most timely information possible when we're making adjustments to in-season data.
Thank you. That's the end of that round, and I will now go to Mr. Entremont for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thanks, of course, for folks being here today to answer our questions. District 33, 34 lobster fishery. So we'll go to that one for a minute on opening and closing of seasons. Probably for the last 10 years, I think, except for this year, every single opening of that season has been put off to a future date because of weather. Most times, weather has a big effect, of course, on our winter fisheries that continue to happen. The lobster fishery in that area normally opens up on the last Monday of November every year, and of course that gets bumped off for weather reasons. How does the consultation go with the industry to make sure everybody's sort of on the same page? Because a lot of times, this will affect sales of that product as you're trying to hit the Christmas season. As you said during your statement or your opening statement, sometimes the decision on seasons happens with a consultation with the industry on product and when the market's best for it, and that's kind of what happens in this particular case. So I'm just wondering how that discussion happens with the industry on weather and other events that continue to happen in and around it.
Thank you very much for the question, Madam Chair. Indeed. So as I noted in my opening remarks, safety is the number one priority in terms of establishing our season dates, our opening and closing dates. And looking at that, that process starts well before the opening of that fishery on any given date in the calendar. It actually starts much earlier. Looking back at last year's season, if there were issues with that opening date, if there were issues throughout the season in terms of safety, if there were other considerations in terms of landings and prices and the supply of that product. And so debrief from that season, which is closed, then moving towards, as the season starts to approach, the advisory process, and in the days and weeks leading up to the opening date, very regular contact between the representatives of those harvester associations, those Indigenous groups, and our regional officials. They're the ones making the call, the ones closest to the water, making the call for those opening dates. And if we do have agreement to shift that, then by all means we do for those safety reasons, recognizing, and the harvesters know themselves, that there could be some economic considerations with that, but that is something which they're aware of.
So flexibility is probably a really good word here, where we have to be able to sort of roll with the weather, we have to be able to roll with the product, we have to roll with the season, so flexibility is probably the big word here.
That's correct, especially when we're dealing with a fishery like lobster, which does not have individual quotas, and is characterized as well, it's a trap-based fishery.
Does quality come into the discussion?
As a secondary factor, absolutely. Quality has a direct relationship to the price at the wharf and the price throughout the supply chain and products as export, but secondary to safety.
Because quality, I think this year in District 33 and 34 was a concern, especially on those first few weeks, that quite honestly, had we known everything we knew, we probably should have bumped it off a little bit, but that, of course, would have been the industry to make that decision. If we're talking about quality, and then we talk about, so we have the big commercial fishery that is in the winter in District 33, 34, and then we have the challenge of FSC and moderate livelihood that happens during the summer months. How does that affect the decision making when we know that there's a fair amount of product that's being taken out of those same waters at the same time, just at a different time of year?
1 minute.
Thanks very much, Madam Chair. Certainly, with respect to moderate livelihood, that is a commercial fishery in the eyes of, it's a rights-based commercial fishery and for the department and for those who practice it. And that is calculated in terms of our estimates and what we think is sustainable for the long-term use of that resource.
And even though the industry would probably be saying that the product isn't good during those times of year.
I can't speak to necessarily the specifics on the quality at given times, but that has been noted.
Discussion. Okay.
Thank you. We now go to this third round, and that begins with Mr. Arnold for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll start again with Mr. Davis, if I could. The issue around the Fraser Sockeye opening or late opening last year came up in directly to me, again, as Mr. Gunn had mentioned earlier, calls from commercial fishers, calls from recreational fishers. I actually had a call from a former DFO management individual concerned with the fishery further up the Fraser River, one that he said actually should have been opened 2 weeks earlier than it did because there was confusion over which stocks were being impacted. They kept the stock closed, or kept the Fraser closed above the confluence at Lytton. They weren't allowing a fishery further upstream at Lillooet because of a run stock that doesn't even go past Lillooet. Can you explain why that fishery was so delayed? And perhaps have you got numbers on the millions of economic opportunity that was probably lost.
Sure, I can speak to the kinds of things that we are trying to assess in season that might influence when we open and close. So the first key factor is, and I won't belabor it because I did mention it earlier, but it's the reality of these co-migrating stocks. And what that means for fishery decisions is we have to assess how much risk we're willing to take in providing a fishing opportunity on the more abundant stock.
I'm just going to interrupt you there because we understand the impacts of co-migrating stocks, but past the point of Lytton, there were not co-migrating stocks in those same waters that could have been opened 2 weeks earlier. Can you describe why it wasn't?
I don't know if I don't know the specifics of this particular instance, so I can only describe the factors that would influence our decision making across instances.
Well, somebody's not passing the communications up the chain to you then, because this was highly communicated to me as a member of this committee and vice chair. It was communicated to DFO staff regularly and repetitively, and yet your department delayed and delayed and delayed. Basically, there was 2 weeks lost from the public fishery at Lillooet because of some confusion over which stocks might be there. Now, I want to go back to some of Mr. Gunn's questioning here. Are there any governing bodies that have veto power over the decision-making of the minister or the department?
No.
Okay. I want to go to a quote from Mr. Griswold, who had been on the Pacific Salmon Committee for 40 years, and he said, I could no longer be party to and complicit in the panel process whose decision-making power I felt was commandeered by the veto power newly granted to the unrepresentative Fraser River Salmon Management Board. He left that panel after 40 years because he could not support what was happening there. This was broadly communicated. Can you explain to the public who are listening to this committee what happened, why he was so disgusted and left?
So as I described earlier, we define an escapement plan. In the development of that, we consult through our advisory processes with recreational, commercial, First Nations users, and we have a collaborative agreement with the Fraser Salmon Management Council, which represents over 70 First Nations in the approach and on the Fraser. And all of that work is inputs to a decision that finally gets made by the department to finalize that escapement plan. That escapement plan, defined before the season starts, is abundance-based. That means it's responsive to changes in abundance in salmon that we encounter in season, and we apply that escapement plan as we get more and more information day by day to what kinds of fishing opportunities we would provide. There is the opportunity in the development of that escapement plan for sort of back and forth. Here's what we're hearing from our advisory processes. Here's what we're hearing from the Fraser Salmon Management Board discussions, so that people can be informed by one another's perspectives, and all of that informs the department's plan.
Why did one side of those discussions seem to outweigh all of the input from all of the other sides, including the science from your own department?
I don't think I'd agree with that characterization. I would say that in post-Big Bar, we have made the escapement plan more conservative in order to get more spawners back to spawning grounds to try and rebuild those stocks that were impacted by the Big Bar landslide in 2019. So that's one of the things that may have changed over the years and made our approaches more conservative. And the other one being some of those constraining stocks that are at lower levels of abundance that we need to do more to protect.
Thank you. We're a little over time there. I'd like to... Please, Serge.
Thank you and welcome, Madam Chair. Monsieur William, je vais commencer avec vous, juste pour revenir peut-être rapidement.
Mr. William, I'll start with you. I just want to come back quickly on my Bloc colleagues' comments. We were talking about another meeting when it came to opening the snow crab season. I am disappointed. I will be frank about efforts made this year when it came to ice breaking. Like every year, we see episodes like this where equipment wasn't there in time. I raised the question last time with other witnesses. We have the equipment, but some equipment is missing. For example, the biggest icebreakers that come from further away. When we need them, my colleague referred to the frog or the amphibious icebreaker. We have an open contract with them. This year, I had to intervene to ensure that that amphibious icebreaker was available at certain points, but we're missing one essential tool, and that is a small icebreaker like the Judy DeMarche, which is never available because priority is granted to the Great Lakes. We need a dedicated icebreaker for our region in order to be able to open the interior of our docks because unfortunately the water's not deep enough. Do you think it would be possible to have dedicated equipment for the Gaspé Peninsula? Because that's where the problems are every year. Can we get equipment dedicated to that region? And could that, in large part, solve the problem of opening the snow crab fishery season?
Merci pour la question.
Thank you for the question.
Thank you for the question, Madam Chair. And certainly I can't speak to the Coast Guard's, availability of its equipment. But certainly I can note the importance of this fishery, that efforts were made, and unfortunately we had some bad instance of ice and high winds this year, which really made things difficult. In terms of
but some year we don't have wind, we don't have we don't have those things. My question is, do you think that the proper equipment dedicated to our region, to the Gulf region, for those shallower water will help the region opening the season earlier?
Thank you very much for the question. I think having equipment on site would invariably assist in that regard. However,
Parfait, monsieur. Thank you, monsieur.
Okay.
Yeah, but I understand. But it's just we don't have the equipment that we need. So this is why I'm asking that if you think that if we have an equipment dedicated for the region, that will help. So thank you for that, Monsieur William ou Monsieur Vigneault. Je continue sur
Mr. Williams or Monsieur Vigneault, I'd like to continue about lobster fishing. Section 23A and 23B. The numbers came out yesterday for putting traps in the water. 23D is going to be delayed. When it comes to the process, often DFO is often blamed, the government is often blamed, saying that we're the ones who made the decision to not open or to open a fishery on a certain day. When it comes to the opening process for lobster, if I'm not mistaken, every wharf has a representative. The representatives give their opinion if they want it to open, and if some of those representatives say, no, we can't open, then the fishery doesn't open. Is that approximately how it works?
In terms of the consultative process, yes, that is how it works. We do strive for consensus, and where we can have consensus, then and safety can be upheld, well, then yes, we would defer to those on the wharf making that call in collaboration with us. However, in times that we can't get a consensus and there are no safety concerns, we are forced as a department to make that decision.
Parfait. Et juste pour faire.
Perfect. Just to make sure, once again, there are representatives at every wharf on those calls who give their opinion, and if they don't agree, once again, with opening at a certain date, you, most of the time, will respect the requests from those representatives of the industry, right?
La Castile.
Thank you for the question.
For every call and for every wharf. And I do know that the associations play an important role here, like the Maritime Fishermen's Union and their representation with DFO.
Thank you. I now go to Mr. Shampoo for 2 minutes et demi.
2 minutes and a half. Thank you, Madam Chair. What I find concerning is that we have very clear concerns that have been very clearly outlined by fishers. However, we're not hearing any commitment. We're not getting an answer. We propose solutions. We talk about problems. We have answers, but we don't have any commitments for what's going to be put in place to avoid having the same situation happen again next year. And we need answers. We need to reassure crab fishers in the Gaspé region and throughout the entire Gulf, because from one year to the next, we can't simply ride the wave of uncertainty. I want to talk to Monsieur Vigneault about reports that are communicated, scientific reports, scientific recommendations that are provided to the department. Those recommendations, which I imagine are accompanied by recommendations, observations. Is that information, are those reports communicated to fishers? And when in the process are fishers included in the conversation?
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much for the question. Yes, absolutely. Fishers are included in the scientific process, which allows us to establish specific scientific recommendations which are published and known by all. We prepare meetings for scientific opinions with the advisory committee. Part of the industry is involved. Industry experts participate in many cases in peer review, where the scientific opinion is developed and bring forward expertise on the data. Once we have a consensus on that scientific opinion, it's published and made available to everyone, and in most cases presented to the consultative committee so that everyone has access to the most recent scientific information so that they can make decisions about the fisheries. So what you're saying is that fishers are an integral part of the process that leads to those recommendations. We still hear, however, that fishers don't think they're sufficiently consulted, that their opinion is not sufficiently considered. Do you have an explanation for that? Contributions of fishers to scientific advisories are based on available scientific data. So yes, in some cases, the recommendation may be different from observations from fishers. However, fishers do have the opportunity to influence decisions made. As I mentioned earlier, the minister considers scientific data, but also other factors, including fishers' opinion. And it's the consultative committee that can bring their perspective. So when it comes to feasibility...
Sorry, time is up. I'm going to go now to Mr. Small for 5 minutes, please. Clifford.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Harvesters in Atlantic Canada have practiced extreme conservation when it comes to fisheries for pelagics, otherwise known as forage fish by foreign-funded activists who lobby DFO and the Minister extremely hard to keep these fisheries at such a low level or even closed, as is the case with mackerel. And we look at herring, and we had openings not long ago in Conception Bay and in Trinity Bay and Bonavista Bay. If you look at the areas that are fished in that herring fishery, you're looking at possibly 5% of the waters that are fished. And that quota is getting taken in anywhere from 12 to 24 hours. Would that indicate to you somehow that possibly that stock is so healthy that the quota is being cut so fast that you may possibly have that quota set at a very low exploitation rate? Do you ever look at that when you look at the opening and closing of these pelagic fisheries, the speed at which the quota is cut?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I can certainly start. Yes, the catch per unit effort is something that we do look at. We do know For example, with those pelagic stocks like herring or mackerel, particularly if it's a seining vessel, those are remarkably efficient. They can catch a lot of tonnage very quickly over the course of several days. So it really depends on gear type as well, and there are other considerations. But yes, we do consider that as part of the information that we collect.
So what other information are you leaning on in the herring stock assessment in the eastern and northeastern coast of Newfoundland, Labrador?
Do you want the stock assessment?
So yeah, the stock assessment is done with part of our science data. As part of this stock assessment, we also look at the catch per unit effort, cases where you would have extremely high catch rate that could be an indicator of a healthy stock, or in several cases cannot be used as the indicator of the stock status because it's the stock that aggregate and there's fishing methods that are.
So are you saying to me that high catch rates are not an indicator of high abundance in a stock?
There could be many, yes, there could be many reasons where you could have a stock that has been depleted and despite that have a very high catch rate. There's actually several examples of that, especially for pelagic stock, shrimp in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, mackerel, and others. So that's why it's certainly discussed as part of the science, but often it's better to use other sets of data to assess the overall stock.
Thank you. I'm going to look at some other species here on the continental shelf. Redfish in 2GHJ and 3K. Witch flounder, winter flounder. There haven't been assessments in these species in quite a few years, which limits fishing potential for harvesters and for processors. Why does it take so long to have an assessment on some of these species when fishermen talk about the abundance of these species, but yet we can't get assessments to prove their abundance, to give additional fishing opportunities to harvesters? Why are you holding back these assessments?
So we're prioritizing the science work to make sure there's regular update to the stock assessment in general. And but yes, we are there's capacity limitations, especially for some of the stock where it's a remote area of the sampling. But there's other examples like redfish unit 1 and 2 where we have increased the more recent stock assessment that enable the opening of that commercial
I'm talking
fishery.
about redfish on the northeast coast now.
Yep.
Now, sorry. Thank you, Mr. Small. I now go to Mr. Morrissey for 5 minutes, please, Robert.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, through you, my question, Monsieur Vino, and you provided good testimony on, and I want to focus on the mackerel stock on the east coast of North America. We had testimony earlier given, and could you confirm and expand the difference between the U.S. southern stock versus the northern stock that is shared with Canada? Are they two, again, pretty distinct, different stocks?
Yes, there are two different biological units. And in fact, in Canada, the only stock that we assess and manage is the northern component.
Yes.
In the United States, because they have a broader area where fishing occurs, they actually do an assessment of the overall combined stock, which is the northern stock that is shared with Canada, and the southern stock that is just fished in the U.S. And the science for the northern stock is similar in our stock assessment versus the U.S., but because the U.S. included in our assessment the large southern component that have seen recent increase, they have different overall science advice.
Madam Chair, through you. So the quota that the Americans have set for harvesting mackerel, how much of it is allocated north and how much on southern stock? Do we know that?
So in the U.S., they don't separate the stock. They allocate, it's a single quota allocation for mackerel fish in the U.S., which in de facto.
Okay, but historically, then, how much of that would come from the southern stock versus the northern stock?
So our estimate that we're using is about 20% of the northern stock would be captured in the U.S., but that will be part of the science peer review committee that's upcoming.
So just to be clear then, so whatever quota allocation they give, historically, about 20% of it comes from the northern stock that's shared with Canada?
Yes, and so and in the U.S., yeah, they have a single quota for the stock. In their calculation, they account for how much the Canada is setting as a quota, and we do the reverse, both from a science perspective in terms of our projection of the possibility of growth given the
because some fishers would be led to believe that the total American quota is coming from the northern stock shared with Canada. For the record, that is not correct?
That is not correct, and we do specific estimation of the smaller portion of it in our science process.
Okay, thank you. Through you, Madam Chair, to Mr. Vino again. We had an excellent presentation given on explaining the difference, which speaks to the issue of what fishers see at sea. You can see abundance of mackerel. But could you explain to the committee the significance of the size of the fish and the size of the fish versus the impact on rebuilding the stock? It's my understanding juvenile mackerel are in abundance, but they are not the size limit that the stock's future depends on.
Yeah, and we'll see what our updated science advice provide, but in our latest science advice, yes, there was still we call it a truncated population, so we see much less large fish than we have seen in LT period. Those fish are important because they contribute more to reproduction.
Right. Could you elaborate, Madam Chair, through you, the significance of the larger mackerel on egg bearing, which is what the stock depends on? If we increase the quota and pick up a lot of the smaller juvenile or the smaller mackerel, how it could negatively impact on the rebuilding of the stock, which everybody acknowledged is moving in the right direction. Am I correct?
Yes, so we've seen some signs of stock growth in our latest assessment. For this stock, we have a model that gives us a sense of if with any amount of fishing or including fishing reduction, what will be the related improvement in the probability for the stock to grow. And that is directly related to the health of the population in terms of having a normal distribution of fish. We will be doing research project this year to further work on the size and the reproductive status of fish, including around Newfoundland. That's all very important information for our ability to project the efficiency of reducing fishing effort in terms of promoting the rebuilding of the stock.
Thank you, Mr. Vino. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Morrissey. We see bells going, so we know there are 30-minute bells.
I cannot hear you, Madam Chair. I think your microphone is not on.
My mic was off. Thank you. Sorry about that. I think we have bells starting. It's a 30-minute bell. So I want to thank the witnesses for coming, giving us testimony. Mr. Arnold?
Madam Chair, we quite often
go 15
provided
minutes.
Unanimous consent to go another 15 minutes, and that still
Yes.
gives us
Do I have
time.
Do I have unanimous consent to go another 15 minutes? Because we have one small thing to deal with as well.
We would agree with finishing with one round.
Finishing the round? Okay, well, actually, you've just finished the round.
Finishing another round, which would be, what, 12 minutes?
Yeah. Is that okay? Yeah. Thanks. Thank you. So you want to go one more round? Yeah. Okay.
Speaker.
Then what we will do is we only have one speaker here for that round, and that's Mr. Gunn. Does everybody else want to put their hands up to speak? Nobody else?
Mr. Deschamps is online now.
Mr. Deschamps? Mr. Shampoo has left. Would you like to be speaker? Okay. All right, so Mr. Gunn and Mr. Duchan, and I think that would be it because we do want to tidy up a little bit of outstanding stuff we need to deal with here. Yeah, you too, Robert. Okay. Anybody else? Okay, good. Okay. So we're going to go with, starting with Mr. Gunn for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. A question again, whoever's best suited to answer, but I'll direct it to you to start, Mr. Williams. Is about the recent decision taken after the International Pacific Halibut Commission reached the conclusion, I believe the Canadian government agreed with this, that for conservation purposes, the total allowable catch of halibut on the Pacific coast should be reduced. Why was the entirety of that reduction borne by Canada and none by the United States?
Good question.
Thank you, Chair. I will refer the question to Mr. Davis in Vancouver.
Thank you. Yes, this is part of a much longer standing issue between Canada and the U.S. in terms of allocations or how we share the resource. We did agree that there was some need to be cautious in setting TACs this year, but we could not agree on how to share or allocate between Canada and the U.S. We agreed to take a small reduction in Canada's allocation this year, but also that we would have follow-up discussions to ideally reach a longer-term understanding around allocations.
Department that if we can't agree on how the reduction of the allowable catch should be split between us and the United States, we just bear the entire economic cost while the United States is allowed to continue fishing?
That has definitely not been our practice. However, in the course of our negotiations, there were consequences proposed by the United States for an inability, if we were unable to reach some kind of understanding around allocation, that Canada weighed against the consequences of accepting a reduction in our share and came to the conclusion that...
Were those consequences a form of economic coercion that would have prevented our seafood products from entering the United States?
Correct.
Okay, so... I mean, the question that I have is what has possibly changed going forward that will prevent that situation from just happening again? And the Americans have clearly set the standard that if they use economic coercion on Canada and Canadian seafood producers, that will just cave.
Well, I mean, I think we have a treaty relationship with the United States. We propose to take like a rational, structured approach to how we arrive at understandings or agreements around allocations that would look at the science, the history of how we've accessed the resource, and a long-standing relationship that we would be looking to maintain to preserve like a collaborative way of managing this shared resource and promoting those things as what should be the basis of arriving at allocations or a way of sharing halibut.
Thank you. I want to go back to my previous line of questioning around the various co-management agreements that have been announced with First Nations as they pertain to fisheries. I think one of the things that is genuinely confusing citizens, and including some people on this committee, is are these agreements, presumably where there are no co-management agreements, you still take into account the opinions and desires of First Nations as you would harvesters, as you would recreational fishermen. So do these co-management agreements, are they essentially creating more bureaucracy with no real power, or are you devolving power from the department and from the government to these shared working groups? Because I can't see how it's not one or the other.
We're formalizing relationships with First Nations in a way that defines how we will collaborate and how we will attempt to reach agreement and also engage with others. So we're putting those down in written agreements as often as a component of an agreement that speaks to other topics as well. And it also sets out, like a formal structure, committees that will convene at a certain sort of period every year, and then the things that we will collaborate on. So it's assigning formality to that, and I think in an attempt to reflect the seriousness with which we take our relationship with First Nations. Ultimately, those are, if we can reach agreement on matters, great, and if we can't, then we still have to make decisions, but they all result in advice to the minister on the matters that are under her regulatory authority.
Is there a concern that, as we saw with the Fraser River sockeye fishery, that the creation of this new kind of bureaucratic step will slow decision-making at DFO from being rapid? And also, what is the commitment to the department around transparency around some of these decisions?
We have gone over time here. Quick answer, please.
We have to fit decision timelines within the biological timelines associated for the resource. So whatever commitments we make, we have to complete consultation in time to make decisions for when fish return.
Thank you. Mr. Weiler, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do want to pick up on something that my colleague, Mr. Clausen, brought up about mass marking. And so with the announcement that was made almost exactly a month ago, what concrete changes should harvesters expect in terms of mark-selected fishing opportunities, and what fisheries in particular, if there are particular regions in BC, can we expect to see those changes first?
Thank you for the question. So first, mass marking will be ramped up, and that won't all happen at once. So it will require additional equipment and staff to apply that equipment and do mass marking. So we expect the ramp up to happen over several years. Second, once the mass marking is complete, as I'm sure you know, it's about 4 years before those fish return. So in that period, it gives us time to be scoping, where might additional opportunities for mark selective fisheries exist. And I should be very explicit that that's not limited to just the recreational fishery. There may also be opportunities to consider terminal fisheries, for example, for First Nations or for sort of some form of economic or commercial fishery. In terms of where might we expect those opportunities, the minister's announcement specified that our increase to mass marking will be for Chinook and in southern BC. So I think we expect to be looking for where more opportunity might exist in the Strait of Georgia, for example, but it may also be relevant to the west coast of Vancouver Island. So those, in very broad terms, those would be the two geographic areas that we would be assessing in terms of additional opportunity.
Thank you. And could you please elaborate? You mentioned terminal fishery. Could you please elaborate what you meant by that?
Yes, sure. So this is a fishery that would happen at or near where the fish are arriving at their spawning grounds. And one of the advantages of that is that typically you will have separated out different stocks, which may be at varying levels of abundance. And if at a terminal location you have a marked, you may have a hatchery component of the return that is marked, and you may have a wild component of the return that's going to their natal streams in that same area. By virtue of increasing mass marking, there may be the scope for more fishing opportunity on those marked fish because we have the confidence they won't have any undesirable impact on the wild stocks that may be also in that same area.
That's very helpful. And you mentioned, obviously, the lead-in timeline, the 4 years or so that we're looking at once we have mass marking to when some of those changes can be put into practice. But what are some of the operational or regulatory steps that would need to take place before those changes are reflected in new opportunities?
Yes, thank you. So we go through an annual process of updating and then finalizing an integrated fisheries management plan. That's the document that essentially sort of spells out all of the different fisheries that we would be planning. So procedurally, my expectation would be we will be assessing a variety of proposals for mark selective fisheries in different areas, targeting different stocks. And through that annual integrated fisheries management planning process, which entails a bunch of consultation in the lead up to its finalization, we would be engaging with different groups to hear proposals. And then internally, we have been developing an evaluation framework. Okay, so we get a proposal. what kinds of indicators do we want to assess that proposal against to make a decision about whether or not we think it is appropriate to implement. So we also expect to finalize that evaluation framework so that there is a consistent and transparent way that we are assessing all of the proposals from our selective fisheries and ultimately making decisions about when and where to implement them.
Thank you very much.
To Mr. Deschênes for 2.5 minutes, please.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much. Madam Chair, congratulations on your election. Following the notes, I know that Mr. Champoux, my colleague, asked some questions on setting a specific date for opening the crab fishery. I just wanted to make sure with Mr. Williams, perhaps. I understand that in the majority of fisheries, specific opening dates are set. That solution proposed by Mr. Desbois, by the Association of Crab Fishers of the Gaspé, do you think that that would give a certain predictability for everyone?
Merci pour la question.
Thank you for the question.
Indeed, we, working with harvesters over the years, have identified an opening date for this fishery, which is more or less consistent every year. Key to that, though, is flexibility to ensure safety on the water and that they can operate effectively in the conditions that are present at the time. So yes, while we do have a date which is set, we also allow flexibility in collaboration with the harvesters, Coast Guard, and Transport Canada to have some flexibility in adjusting that date if required.
Mais la question c'est si
the question is if Mr. Desbois' proposal to ensure that the ice is broken, if we set a date without it necessarily being the official start date of the fishery, but the time by which the ice has to be opened, in your opinion, would that suggestion solve the problems that we experienced this year?
Merci pour la question.
Thank you for the question.
I think with any plan, such as setting an opening date, we have to ensure that we have contingencies. And in some cases, we set a plan and we rely on the Coast Guard to provide a vessel for a certain date. And we do know that things can change, either with the vessel or with environmental conditions, which necessitate changes to that plan. And so therefore, flexibility with those plans in collaboration with industry needs to be maintained.
That brings us to the end, and I want to congratulate this committee. You must have built-in clocks because we've got exactly 15 minutes left to vote. And thank you very much to the witnesses for being here. And thank you. I think we will adjourn for the votes.